Most Christians know that John Newton wrote Amazing Grace and that he was once a slave ship captain, but little is known more than that. This is a shame because his story is powerful and riveting, and it's surely a great testament to the amazing grace, in fact, as great as you can find in the annals of Christianity as far as I'm concerned. Newton started his adult career as a sailor. He was an angry young man with an attitude, and in those days the officers and the captains on the ships where he served came to absolutely despise him. He had a volatile temper, he was lazy, and his quick wit was used sarcastically, which endeared him to no one. Eventually, Newton ended up working in Africa with a slave trader who bought slaves from the tribal chiefs. Mostly the slaves were prisoners from intertribal wars and criminals, but there were also some women. These unfortunate men and women were sold to passing slave ships who would take them to America or to the West Indies, where they would be sold for plantation work. Newton soon lost favor with his new boss's wife, who was an African herself, and while he was sick, she treated him so badly he almost died from his illness, plus the fact that she barely fed him. His boss had been away, but shortly after he returned, a fellow slave trader lied about Newton and said he'd been stealing from them. At that point, John Newton was made a slave himself. He'd come to stay with his boss as an apprentice, but now he was kept in chains much of the time, and when he was free from the chains, he was forced to do field work alongside the African slaves. Eventually, he was freed, and on his way back to England, his ship encountered a storm so fierce it seemed that all on board would surely perish. For the first time in years, John Newton began to pray. Amazingly, the ship survived and came limping into a port in Ireland. John Newton, seeing God's hand in preserving their lives, became a believer in Jesus Christ. Most people assume that Newton was a slave ship captain first, then he came to Christ, and then he repented and left the horrid business of slavery. In fact, it was the reverse. Newton gave his life to Jesus before he ever served as a slave ship captain. In Britain in those days, the church had not yet awakened to the evils of slavery, and as a new believer, Newton didn't see a thing wrong with transporting Africans in irons and the hot, stifling belly of a ship to faraway lands where they'd live out the rest of their days as slaves on foreign soil. Still, the brutality of his position bothered him, and he hoped one day he might make his living in a more compassionate manner. God responded to that hope by allowing him to suffer a stroke just before he was to leave for his fourth voyage as a ship's captain. Newton was forced to take a land-based job, and thus his days as slave ship captain were brought to a halt, not due to a guilty conscience, but to the providential hand of God. If Newton could not see the evil of his occupation, God surely could, and made a way providentially to bring it to an end. Newton began to earnestly study the Scriptures, and eventually he was ordained and became a minister. One day at the end of the year 1772, John wanted a hymn to accompany a sermon he was going to preach about David and his question to the Lord, "Who am I that you've brought me this far?" John thought about his own experience and how far God had brought him from his days serving as a slave in Africa. He sat at his desk and wrote the words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." He wrote several verses, and it was taught to his church the day he preached his sermon about the grace of Jesus Christ. Today, Amazing Grace is without a doubt the most sung, most loved, and most recorded hymn in the history of Christianity. As he grew older, Newton recognized the evils of slavery, and he repented of those years he worked in that terrible business. In his latter years, he, along with his friend William Wilberforce, became Britain's most forceful voices to oppose the slave trade, and eventually their opposition, along with others, gathered momentum and forced the politicians to end slavery. Amazing Grace had done its work very well. The arrogant, disagreeable, obnoxious young man, despised by nearly every ship's captain and officer under which he served, had been transformed into a warm, friendly, compassionate minister of the gospel who fought the evil of slavery and promoted the amazing grace of Jesus Christ.